Welcome to this AP lecture on the Mongols. I love talking about the Mongols because they're kind of complicated. So on the one hand, the Mongols are oftentimes stereotyped as probably the most barbaric group in world history. And to some extent, that's true. Give you an example. When the Mongols went out and conquered, they would actually catapult bodies that were diseased into towns in order to spread the disease and take over the towns. Okay. Not so great, right? But at the same time, the Mongols did some amazing things in world history that we oftentimes forget. The Mongols connected the world together. The Mongols spread culture. The Mongols actually adopted local cultures. And the Mongols even opened up Europe to, well, do all the things that we know today it did, like exploration. So let's jump into it and see why the Mongols are a bit complicated. Okay, the first thing we have to understand is the context about where the Mongols came from. And this really influences everything. In the case of the Mongols, what ended up happening was they came from Mongolia, and Mongolia was an incredibly difficult place to live in. There weren't a lot of resources. It was incredibly cold. It was a difficult place to be. And at the time, the Mongols were separated into clans of families. Along came this guy, Genghis Khan, who was an orphan, and he united them all together through charisma. And eventually he taught them how to not only be organized in the military, but to expand. And he had a huge innovation. He had them train on their horses where they could actually ride on their horses while shooting arrows at the same time. It's never been done before, and it's incredibly difficult to do. Eventually, they would create saddles that would allow them to do this, that would allow them to actually ride at very high speeds. In fact, the only thing that stopped them was two things. One, climate change, and two, the ability to use guns in India. That's how powerful they were. Now, when Genghis Khan spread outwards, he definitely had that success through his military, but he also had another way of gaining those successes. He would actually go to local villages and say, hey, look, you got a choice. If you are a local serf, join up with us. We'll give you freedom and we'll give you land if you join with us. Now, he wasn't doing this to be a good, equal kind of guy. He wasn't the Bernie Sanders of that time period. He was doing this to win. But by doing this, he undermined feudalism. He actually gave freedom to peasants and serfs as he went along. Now, at the same time, Genghis Khan made a huge mistake. Genghis Khan never chose a successor. Kind of typical mistake that was made at that time. So after this time, a number of successors arose. There was a guy named Ogadai, another guy named Hulegu. There was also Kublai Khan, all of his sons and grandsons. But they kind of separated out the empire into what are known as khanates. And these khanates were never, ever again united. Now, one thing they did do that was kind of helpful to local cultures is that when they conquered in an area, they would adopt the local culture, especially Islam. That's why many historians say that while the Mongols conquered, once they settled down, they were eventually conquered themselves. Okay, let's take a look at the khanates. So let's start off with China. So in the case of China, one of his sons, Ogadai, took over, and eventually his son, Kublai Khan, would take over and form the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty united China and actually adopted Chinese policies, like, for example, the civil service exam and the scholar bureaucrat kind of way of doing things. Now, at one point, Yuan was pretty successful, but at one point they attempted to attack Japan. They did this on two different occasions. On both occasions, they failed, and they failed because of local typhoons. In Japan, these typhoons became known as spiritual winds, or you might know them as what's called kamikazes. Yeah, that's exactly what would be called for the dive bombers in World War II. The importance of the Yuan dynasty is not just going to be for uniting China. We're going to see how it was important for Europe as well. Second major place was in Persia. So this was another major khanate. The Mongols conquered in this area, and eventually one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Hulegu, would become in charge. This would be known today as what we know as Iran and Iraq. What's really important about this is the Middle East becomes an area that is not only Persian, but is also of Mongolian descent as well. The other major khanate was in Russia. So Russia is very complicated. In the case of Russia, the Vikings actually invaded from the west, but eventually from the east, the Golden Horde, the Mongol group, invaded, and they would mix together with the Vikings and create a central state known as the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus eventually adopted Orthodox Christianity because the Mongols were very open to the religions of the area, and they established a strong centralized state that expanded outwards and conquered the Slavic people within that region. Next up is Europe. So Europe got a little bit lucky. The Mongols almost invaded Europe. They got all the way out to Eastern Europe, but then they had to stop. Why? Well, Genghis Khan died, and when he did, the sons went back for his funeral, and Europeans were really worried that at some point they were going to return, but they never did. And the reason why had to do with the end of the Little Ice Age. It was incredibly cold and damp. It was difficult for them to ride their horses through, so they never did conquer within Europe. But they are going to have a major impact in Europe as far as getting Europeans to go out and explore. Talk about that in a minute. Okay, so what are the impacts of the Mongols? The Mongols definitely have a lot of barbaric practices, but they're incredibly positive practices they did as well. They reopened the Silk Road trade routes, and because of their strength, they protected them and allowed for the advancements of goods and ideas back and forth. They adopted local cultures. That was another major positive for them. And on top of all that, not so good, they accidentally advanced the Black Death. So because they opened up all these trade routes, the Black Death went from China all the way out to Europe. Okay, not so great, but here's what they did do for Europe that would be pretty powerful. The Mongols got the Europeans thinking about the East, and the Europeans realized they were pretty backwards and needed to do something different. So the Marco Polo family went out, and that Polo family eventually got into contact with the Yuan dynasty, where they got a lot of the technological and navigational types of things that they needed in order to do European exploration. So if you're living in America, you can thank the Mongols for that one. Okay, see you in class.